Chapter 13, Friends or Foes? The crisp winter air of Merry Hollow nipped at Holly's cheeks as she and Jack made their way down Candy Cane Lane. Their first stop was the cozy gingerbread cottage of Mrs. Peppermint, Holly's elderly neighbor and longtime friend. As they approached, Holly felt a twinge of guilt. Mrs. Peppermint had always been kind to her, offering sage advice and warm cookies whenever Holly needed a sympathetic ear. Now, she was about to interrogate the sweet old elf under false pretenses. "Remember," Jack whispered as they reached the door, "we're just here for a friendly chat. Don't push too hard." Holly nodded, taking a deep breath before knocking. The door creaked open, revealing Mrs. Peppermint's smiling face, framed by her trademark silver curls. "Holly, dear. What a lovely surprise," Mrs. Peppermint exclaimed, her eyes twinkling. Her gaze shifted to Jack, curiosity evident. "And who's this handsome young man?" "This is Jack Frost, Mrs. Peppermint. He's new in town," Holly explained, forcing a cheerful smile. "We were hoping we could come in for a chat. I've brought some of my peppermint swirl cookies." Mrs. Peppermint's face lit up. "Well, you know I can never resist your baking. Come in, come in." As they settled into Mrs. Peppermint's cozy living room, surrounded by knitted blankets and the soft glow of enchanted candles, Holly steered the conversation towards the recent events in Merry Hollow. "It's been such a difficult time since Mayor Kringle's passing," Holly said, watching Mrs. Peppermint's reaction carefully. "I don't suppose you've heard any rumors about what might have happened?" Mrs. Peppermint's jovial expression faltered for a moment. "Oh, dear. It's all so tragic. But you know, Holly, sometimes it's best not to pry into matters that don't concern us." Jack leaned forward, his icy blue eyes intent. "But surely, Mrs. Peppermint, as one of Merry Hollow's most respected elders, you must have some insight into the town's deeper workings?" The old elf's eyes narrowed slightly, a flash of something, suspicion? Fear? Crossing her face. "Well," she said slowly, "I suppose there have always been those in Merry Hollow who take their responsibilities very seriously. Guardians of our traditions, you might say." Holly and Jack exchanged a quick glance. This was the closest anyone had come to openly acknowledging the Guardians of Yuletide. "Guardians?" Holly pressed gently. "What kind of guardians, Mrs. Peppermint?" The elderly elf seemed to catch herself, shaking her head with a forced chuckle. "Oh, just a figure of speech, dear. Now, who would like more hot cocoa?" As they left Mrs. Peppermint's cottage an hour later, Holly's mind was whirling. They hadn't gotten any concrete information, but the old elf's evasiveness and subtle hints had confirmed their suspicions. The Guardians of Yuletide were real, and they held significant influence in Merry Hollow. "We need to talk to someone who might be more willing to share," Jack mused as they walked. "Someone who's been around long enough to know the town's secrets, but maybe isn't as invested in keeping them." Holly's eyes lit up. "I know just the person. Frost T, Snowman. He's the oldest resident in Merry Hollow, and he's always had a bit of an outsider perspective." They found Frost T, Snowman in his usual spot in the town square, his coal eyes surveying the bustling Christmas market. As Holly and Jack approached, the ancient snowman turned to regard them with a knowing look. "Ah, young Holly Evergreen and the mysterious Jack Frost," he rumbled, his voice like ice cracking. "I wondered when you two would come seeking answers." Holly blinked in surprise. You were expecting us?" Frost T, Snowman chuckled, a sound like falling icicles. "My dear, when you've been around as long as I have, very little comes as a surprise. You're here about the Guardians of Yuletide, are you not?" Jack stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "What do you know about them?" The snowman's coal eyes glittered. "More than most, less than some. But knowledge, young ones, comes with a price." Are you prepared to pay it? Holly and Jack exchanged a determined look. We are, Holly said firmly. For the next hour, Frosty, Snowman regaled them with tales of Mary Hollow's early days, of the founding of the Guardians, and of the secret rituals that had shaped the town's magical destiny. He spoke of midnight ceremonies in the Whispering Woods, of oaths sworn on enchanted candy canes, and of the terrible price of betrayal. The Guardians believe they protect Mary Hollow, Frosty, Snowman explained, his voice low. But their methods, well, let's just say that not all who enter their ranks do so willingly. As they listened, Holly felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. The Guardians of Yuletide were far more sinister than she had imagined. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Holly, Frosty, Snowman said, his coal eyes fixed on her, you should know that the Guardians often recruit from Mary Hollow's most prominent families. Those with deep roots in the town's magical traditions. Holly's heart sank as the implication hit her. No, she whispered. Not Noelle. She couldn't be involved in this. But even as she protested, memories surfaced, Noelle's evasiveness when discussing the mayor's death, her sudden interest in ancient Christmas lore, the strange symbols Holly had glimpsed in her friend's toy shop. Jack placed a comforting hand on Holly's shoulder. We can't jump to conclusions. We need proof. Thanking Frosty, Snowman for his insights, Holly and Jack made their way towards Noelle's toy shop. Holly's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Noelle had been her best friend since childhood. The thought of her being involved with a secret society responsible for murder and magical manipulation was almost too much to bear. As they neared the toy shop, Jack suddenly pulled Holly into a shadowy alley. Look, he whispered, pointing to a group of figures hurrying down the street. Holly's eyes widened as she recognized several prominent Mary Hollow residents, including Noelle, slipping into an abandoned gingerbread factory on the outskirts of town. It must be a meeting of the Guardians, Jack murmured. This is our chance to gather some real evidence. Carefully, they made their way to the factory, finding a partially open window through which they could observe the gathering. Inside, a group of about a dozen elves, humans, and magical creatures stood in a circle, their faces serious in the flickering candlelight. Jack pressed his hand against the window, a thin layer of ice spreading from his touch. This will help amplify the sound, he explained quietly. Through the magical ice, snippets of conversation reached their ears. The balance is shifting. Must act soon, before it's too late. The snow globe's power is waning. Kringle was going to expose everything. Holly's heart raced as she listened. They were finally getting some answers, but each revelation brought more questions. What balance were they talking about? What was the significance of the snow globe? Suddenly, Noelle's voice cut through the murmurs, clear and passionate. We took an oath to protect Mary Hollow, no matter the cost. We cannot falter now, not when we're so close to. Before she could finish, a floorboard creaked beneath Jack's foot. The gathered Guardians fell silent, heads turning towards the window. Someone's there, a voice cried out. Holly and Jack didn't wait to see what would happen next. They ran, their feet crunching in the snow as they fled back towards the town center. Behind them, they could hear shouts and the sound of pursuit. They didn't stop running until they reached Holly's cottage, slamming the door behind them and reinforcing it with every protection spell they knew. As they caught their breath, the weight of what they had witnessed settled over them. Holly, Jack said gently, I'm so sorry about Noelle. I know how much her friendship means to you. Holly sank into a chair, her head in her hands. I can't believe it. Noelle, a member of the Guardians? Involved in all this darkness? It doesn't make sense. Jack knelt beside her, his cool hand comforting on her arm. People are complex, Holly. Noelle might believe she's doing the right thing, protecting Mary Hollow in her own way. But at what cost? Holly looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Murder?